Hello everybody, I'm Nick, and this video is the second part of our cracking the .NET interview, all about the refactoring test that you might encounter, and it's all about being asked to refactor an existing legacy piece of code usually. Now, if this is the first video you see in the series, I highly recommend you go to the first part first, you check that, and then you understand how we landed here, because I think there's much valuable information in that first video. That being said, if you have already watched it, please stay along and let's go dive into it. Before I show you the code and before I talk about what I'm going to do today, I just want to mention that if you like this type of content and you want to see more, please subscribe and ring the same notification bell so you get notified when I upload a new video. And something else that's very weird is that only 30% of you watching are actually subscribed. So I would really appreciate it if you're a regular viewer who enjoys the content to actually click that subscribe button. It really helps me. You can't imagine how much. So without any further ado, let's go straight into the code. So what we had here from the last time is we ended up writing a few unit tests to make sure that the logic is guarded and we are ready to now refactor the user service add user method, where we're going to identify what is wrong with it and we're going to try to make it cleaner. It's all about that. So before I talk you through the lines, I want to address something else, which is in the comments somebody mentioned, why didn't you rename firname as the parameter in this method? Because firname is referring to first name, which normally you wouldn't abbreviate, you would just say first name as the parameter. The problem is that if somebody chooses to use, since this needs to be backwards compatible, anything we do, we wouldn't break this code if I was to rename this, but the system, or actually the test says that assume that this is part of a bigger system. So if somebody was to use that method using named parameters or named arguments and had something like this, because some people like to do this even when they don't have optional parameters, then I would break their code, because they would need to update the named argument to point to the new value. So that change is not backwards compatible. You probably won't get failed for doing it, but the interviewer will question you about it. It's one of the smaller things that you might not think about when working for code that needs to be backwards compatible, but it would be a breaking change, and in a realistic scenario, you'd have to increase the major version of the package and document it, which we cannot do here. Any change we do needs to be backwards compatible. So keep that in mind, try to think outside of the box. So back to what we have to do now. Here, the first thing that I can see is that we're doing validation for this request here, and this add user knows about the validation. We're doing it here, and we're also doing it here. Now, in a realistic scenario where you do this from scratch in a new piece of software, I would argue that this sort of validation would happen outside this method on the maybe on the API level, to make sure that the user is providing the fields that they should provide. I don't know if check for email should be there. This should definitely not be there, but things like the field is not empty is something outside of the domain, but it could very much be part of the domain as well. Because we're so tangled with DDOs and domain here, I won't be making a validator per type of thing I'm validating on different layers. I will just call it a user validator and move my logic for validation there. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a new validators folder, because the reason why we're doing this, in case you didn't understand or didn't explain it, is that this method shouldn't know how to validate directly. It should use a validator who's responsible for knowing what it should do. This is all about adding a user, not about knowing so much about the validation logic. So I'm going to go ahead and create a new class called user validator. And before I put anything there, what I like doing is I like extracting the things that need to be extracted in this method first, in this class, and then moving it to the user validator. So the first thing I want to extract is this, and I want to say has valid full name. And the reason why I don't say user has valid full name is because this will be moved to the user validator. So you understand who needs to have a valid full name from the name of the class. So I don't need to repeat myself by saying user this, user that in something called a user validator. Like, I would argue that even the method being called add user in this user service is redundant. But in any case, I'm going to extract this. Now, the check is wrong because it says user has valid full name, but I didn't want to call it user has invalid full name, because negative checks that are being negated are very hard to read. So instead, what I'm going to do is I'm going to negate here, and I'm going to go on this, and I'm going to negate the check. So I turned it into a valid full name check. So I reverted it. And if I run the test by just saving, since I have continuous testing on, you can see that the tests are passing. So that was the first check. The second one is has valid email. So has valid email. I know that this valid email check is not really a valid check to begin with, but we cannot change that logic, because any change that fixes the logic wouldn't be backwards compatible with what the code is expecting right now. So I'm negating that as well and saving, and as you can see, nothing is breaking. And I'm gonna go back and I'm gonna extract the age check as well. So here the age check is getting an offset and is trying to make sure that you are not younger than 21 years old. So you need to be at least 21 years old. So if user is at least 21 years old, and yes, this check was inverted for me automatically. This is amazing. And I'm gonna go in that method. I like using var instead of using the int or explicitly specifying what the thing is. And now if the age is more or equals to 21, then we are returning. And by saving, you can see that my tests are passing, and I have tests for these cases. So if I was breaking the logic, the tests would fail. I almost died there. And the last thing is that, assuming you have a credit limit, the credit limit is less than 500, then you're still an invalid user. So if user has credit limit which is less than 500, actually the wording here is a bit weird, so we don't need the user. Has credit limit and limit is less than 500. That's more appropriate. Now we're gonna treat everything, again, like I said, under the same banner of user validator, but I'll show you, once I move them, a small trick to keep the logic in the main method more to the point. So this method should contain everything about the validation. I'm gonna go ahead and add everything that we're missing, and now we also need this user time, the datetime provider that we had from the previous video. I'm gonna put this here now. Here you go, and inject it from the constructor, and all of them need to be changed to public. So I could use Control H and do this automatically, but where would be the fun in that? I just almost broke the code. Fine. Cool. So now this is fine. I need to remove the datetime provider from here as well, and here as well. And I'm gonna need you. Cool. But I now instead need the private read-only user validator. The reason why there isn't an interface for that user validator is because I won't be mocking it. I don't need to mock anything about it. I will mock one of its dependencies, but not the thing itself. So I don't need to have an interface for this specific use case. And this one is new user validator with a new datetime provider. And we are going to use the user validator dot here. Here you go. Now, a couple of things here could be, oh, the test broke, so I have to address that as well. You go here, user validator, datetime provider, which is now a dependency, missing bracket because I have fat fingers, and now everything should be passing. And this gives me so much confidence when it comes to refactoring, because I don't need to worry about breaking anything. I have my tests checking everything about the code. If they break, I know I broke something. So here I have 3 checks that are like prerequisites to the whole request to be started. You can argue that the age check is very domain specific, and I do agree we could just extract those three things, but I'm going to group them anyway because I'm going to treat it as user provided data is valid. So I'm going to say extract method, user provided data is valid, and the check is inverted, so if it's invalid it returns false, and if I save and expand my test you can see that they all pass. And now I have this individual check that is summarizing all the incoming property validation. Then I'm gonna fix this because it's really getting through my nerves. I don't know what key binding I just pressed, but it worked. So the main beast, which is this part here, right? This is a clear open close violation. Every time we want to treat a client specifically based on their name, we need to edit this method and add the new case with an else if. There's another thing here which I think I would gloss over later, so I'm just going to mention it. We're using codes, we're using comments here, or at least the code is using comments to explain what the logic is, and that's a big no-no. In general, the only comments you want to leave anywhere in your code are either method summaries, which are not really comments, but this type of thing you want to have, especially in public members. You don't want to have comments like this. Forget about this. This is absolutely, I wouldn't say horrible, but it's really bad. The only comments you want to have are to-do comments that can be filtered and searched, and they imply intent rather than code behavior. Mainly because the comments can lie, they can, don't use them. Like, I'd rather have this, skip credit check, and now I don't need the comment because the code is the comment, and it tells me anything I need to know about this. And I can do this with all the methods. I can do credit check, which even do credit check sounds vague. Like, aren't you doing that anywhere? Like, you're not really doing the credit check here, you're checking about the credit here. Here you're just assigning some values. So even the comments in this case are actually lying. But I'm gonna remove them anyway. I don't really care about them. To give you an idea about the logic we're gonna be dealing with, if the client name is very important client, then the credit limit check is false, and we won't check about the user's credit limit. If they're an important client based on the name, then they have a limit, but it's twice what the credit limit service is providing. And then any other user has a credit limit, which is the exact limit that the API is returning for that user. So there's so many ways to deal with this violation, strategy patterns. I don't want to name any others because I have a very specific way I like dealing with this. Plus, I don't want to give away how you could try and solve this with something different than what I'm going to show you. But what I'm gonna do is a bit of a, like, it falls under flex coding, like you're doing it just to show that you can do it. It's gonna be perfectly correct and perfectly performant and reliable and what you want to do, but it goes over what some people might think that the solution to this problem will be. So don't feel like you have to solve that problem in that very specific way. There's many ways you can do it. And one of the other reasons why I'm choosing to go over the top with the solution is because if you actually watch this video and you encounter this test and you try to copy what I did in this video in your test, and the interviewer saw the video as well, you're going to get questioned about it. So that's another reason why I'm doing it. So let's go ahead and see how I would solve this, right? This is an open close violation. So normally I would have some sort of handler per type of client name and then a default. And that's how I would go about it. And then I would just send a request and say, that's the name client. What credit calculator provider do you want me to deal with, with some sort of factory? So let's do that. So the first thing I want to do is I'm going to create a new folder and I'm going to name them credit providers. Now, should this be in a folder called credit providers? Not necessarily, but it does, in this limited context, give some organization to the classes. So I'm going to use it anyway. I'm going to close the ones I don't need to use. I don't need you, I don't need you, I definitely don't need you. And in here, I'm going to create a single interface called credit details or credit limit provider. And this interface will have two things. First, it will have a method called getCreditLimits, and it's going to accept a user. And I could make an object for this, but I could as well just use a tuple here, and I'm going to say bool has credit limit and credit limit. I could, of course, like I said, create an object about this one, but I'm gonna show that I also know how to use this, and it's perfectly fine. You don't need to make an object just for that. You could, but you don't need to. And the other thing I need is a property, which can be the name requirement, and this will be a getter only property. Now I have three use cases, which is the very important client, which doesn't have a limit check, important client, which has some logic, and then the default. So I'm gonna go ahead and start with the default provider. So default credit limit provider, and I'm gonna say I credit limit provider, and I'm gonna say that the requirement here is string.empty, so there is no limit. And I'm gonna show you how I'm gonna tie it into the rest of the logic when I'm done with the others. And here, all I need to do is go to the user service, grab this fella, and this method will be pure, meaning it won't be assigning anything to the user. It will just use the user as an argument, and the assignment will happen in the user service itself. So the responsibility of the provider is to provide the data, not to set anything. So this line, bye-bye. The only thing I'm gonna say is var credit limit equals this, and now I need to inject this credit limit service. So I'm gonna go ahead and copy that, and since I won't use it anywhere else in this method or class, I'm gonna go ahead and delete it fully. Why you didn't like this? Oh yeah, here we go. And I'm gonna inject it here. So you go here, you go here, you go here, and return the has credit limit is true, and then the number is the exact thing I get back. So this is true, and this is credit limit. So I just made the default credit limit provider, and now I need to make the other two. One will be for the important client, and the other one will be for the very important client. So let's go ahead and create that. Important client credit limit provider, I credit limit provider, yada yada yada, implement those things. And then the name, I'm gonna go ahead and copy it, important client, here we go. We paste it here, and then the logic for the important client is copy that. Where am I? Here we go. Like I said, pure method. We don't actually mutate the user in any way, shape, or form. Wait a second. This should also be deleted. Good catch. And this doesn't need to be here. Cool. So now we're gonna return the limit is true, and the credit limit is the value multiplied by 2, and we need to inject the private read-only I user credit service. Yes, that's it. And inject it. So here we go, and we need one last one of these fellas for the very important client credit limit provider. Nice long descriptive names. I credit limit provider, here we go, yada yada yada. And the value is, let me just copy the right name because I don't want to have to worry about messing it up. And here there is no logic, the value is just return has credit limit false and the default of an integer, which is 0. And now we have all the providers. Now, obviously this logic has to go, correct? Yes. And the two things that we want is that user dot credit limit equals something, and user dot has credit limit equals something. Let's just limit them, like default them to the default thing. So here what I need is something to give me the right provider. So provider goes here, equals credit limit provider factory? Maybe. Let's say yes. Get provider by client name and say client.name. And then now we have it, we can get the var credit. In fact, I could actually do something cool. I could say var has credit limit, comma, credit limit equals provider dot get credit limits, provide the user and get that, and then all I can say is has credit limit and credit limit. And now I just need the credit limit provider factory. So I'm gonna go ahead and do that. So in the credit providers, I'm gonna create a factory. Do I need it to be an interface? I don't really need to be an interface. So I'm gonna say credit limit provider factory and create that. And now what we're gonna do here is a bit of a stretch in what you could do. Normally you'd have something like this done automatically based on convention, but here we're gonna get our hands dirty and we're gonna write it ourselves. So something that is scanning, finding the providers, initializes them, and then returns them. Now, we could create a new provider every time for every request. In this scenario, I'm gonna pre-initialize all the providers and use them as singletons, since they are pure methods that don't mutate the object and they're completely stateless. But you could very much change the name of this from a provider factory to a holder, an orchestrator. It's completely up to you. In this scenario, since you don't know how they're being returned, something like this could even be internal and you wouldn't even get exposed to it. I'm gonna call it the factory. So what I need here is a private read-only dictionary. In fact, I read-only dictionary because I don't want this to be mutatable in any way, shape, or form. So except a string, which string will be the name requirement, and it returns an I client provider. And I'm calling this credit limit providers. Here we go. And I'm gonna be initializing this in the constructor. So once for the factory for the whole lifetime, and we're gonna treat it as a singleton as well. And the way we're gonna return them is we're gonna have a public, what do I call it? Get provider by client name. And it returns an I credit limit provider, and then you accept the client name. Assuming that this requirement changes in the future, you might want to accept the whole client object instead here and base your check off of client properties, not just the name. But since we're refactoring what we already have, I don't need to use the client or the whole object, so I'm just going to use the string instead. And then we're going to return it by saying client providers client name. We're gonna fix some checks around this because the client provider might not exist in the dictionary, but fundamentally this is what we're going for. And then here we would have something like private read-only credit limit provider factory, initialize from here and delete from here. Let's say new credit limit provider factory here. Here we go. And let's fix our tests so this service goes away. That being said, I'm probably gonna need that. And new provider factory goes here. So if I save and I run my tests, they obviously now fail because there is nothing in that provider to, the factory to provide a provider. Now this is the part where I might scare you with what I'm gonna do, but bear with me, it actually does solve the problem. Many people might object that I'm gonna use reflection because I am gonna use reflection and that's slow, but a reflection is only slow for when you're initializing it. And since I will treat this as a singleton which is being injected and it's maintained for the lifetime of this service, there's nothing wrong with using it because the initialization, which can be very fast by the way, reflection isn't slow anymore really, then there will be no problem. It's actually an absolutely perfect and acceptable way to do this. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna say type of, I'm gonna choose a type in this assembly. So credit limit provider .assembly.exported types, and these are the types that this specific assembly is exporting. And I'm gonna say where this type, and in fact, let's just overkill here provider type and save the type in a reference and reuse it in a couple of places. And I'm going to say credit limit provider type dot is assignable from X, which is the type, and X is not an interface and is not abstract. The reason why I'm doing this is because I'm scanning all the things that implement the iCredit limit provider. And I'm doing that because now I'm able to initialize them, pre-initialize them in the factory, and be able to find them out based on the request that they get. Now, the problem I have with doing this dynamically is that the default and the important client classes have the user credit service as a parameter or an argument in the constructor, while the very important doesn't, because it doesn't need to. To keep it consistent, you could just inject it without actually doing anything about it. I'm just gonna do something else. What I'm gonna say is I'm gonna select, I'm gonna say parameter less constructor equals x dot get constructors dot single or default, where get parameters dot length equals 0. So basically get the at least one parameterless constructor for this implementations. And now I can say return parameterless constructor is not null, then use activator to initialize the thing. So create instance if else activator dot create instance x comma, and this is where we're gonna now inject the private read-only I user credit service that this factory requires. In fact, I don't even need it here, I just need it injected, and I'm gonna use it as a parameter here. If you don't exactly understand what I'm doing with this bit, basically I'm trying to get the parameterless constructor for the very important client first, and if there is a constructor that has parameters, then the only acceptable use case is a single parameter, which is the user credit service. So I'm reusing the same injectable thing, keeping them testable even through the factory. And now that I have that, I can say dot cast as an I credit limit provider, and then to immutable dictionary, with the first thing being the name requirement and the second thing being the instance itself. And now I have all my pre-initialized credit providers in the dictionary, and every time I just want to add a new one, I just create a new class with like super very important provider. I give a name and a logic, and it automatically will be picked up, fixing the open closed principle both on the class and the method level, and being able to use a very dynamic approach to solve the problem. And now this is clearly wrong because we don't want to deal with it like this. What we're going to say instead is var provider equals client providers dot get value or default, and by getting default we now have a null to deal with if there is no provider specific for the client, which in this scenario will default to the default scenario, which is the string is empty. And I'm going to extract this for readability, so I'm going to say default credit limit provider, which we know for a fact that will always be there. And with that out of the way, I'm gonna go ahead and fix all the missing dependencies. So this needs to have the new user credit service client here, and the tests need to have the new user credit service client here. And if I save, I have failing tests. Perfect. Why is this failing? Oh, I shouldn't have initialized a new client here. I should use the mock instead. That was on me. User credit service, save, and my tests are now passing because, and let's just quickly debug one of them. Let's say we're debugging the good use case scenario. Yep, should be true. So let's go ahead and debug this. Yes, here we go. So test is running and I have hit the endpoint, the breakpoint. So I'm gonna go here. Yep, this is provided. We get the client from the mock, and now we're gonna get the provider from the dictionary. So as you can see, we have 3 providers pre-initialized. You don't need to have them pre-initialized. You could just have instructions on how to be initialized and create one every single time, but since they're pure methods and they're stateless, there's no reason why we cannot just keep them in state in memory. And we get that. In that scenario, we have a provider, so we return it, it's the correct one. And we get the credit limit, which is true, and 1,000 or 12,000, 1,200, Jesus. And everything works absolutely fine. So this is how we now fixed this violation once and for all. Every time we need to deal with new providers, we just create a new provider, implement the interface, use it with a different name, and then automatically they will map. And that's where I'm gonna leave this video. Let's replace that to var. So what we did is we fixed the dependency inversion principle, and we're able to inject now and test the service. We extracted some of the responsibility of the validator into its own validator class. We, in fact, this thing can also be extracted in the method, and let's just say apply credit limits. So now this reads even better, where we just apply credit limits in here. Using a factory, we're getting the provider appropriate for the name, and then we are getting a credit limit dynamically, and in the end we're doing a check and we create. And that is where I'm going to leave this code. There isn't really much else we can do on this one. If you have any other suggestions to make this cleaner or apply more principles, please leave a comment and let me know. But I think that this is a test that is passing with flying colors, and it's addressing all the major issues that they are presented to the person being interviewed. That's all I had for you for this video. Thank you very much for watching. Special thanks to my Patreons for making these videos possible. If you want to support me as well, you're going to find the link in the description down below. Leave a like if you like this video, subscribe for more content like this, ring the bell as well, and I'll see you in the next video. Keep coding.